Hello and welcome to the Trajectory Nano series. This is the first of 4 weekly Nano series sessions leading into Trajectory Live on August 26th and 27th. Before we get into this week's topic, some important details for you. All participants are required to follow the code of conduct. It has been posted into chat for you to review. Please use the hashtag TrajectoryNano when sharing your content on social media. We'll be taking questions after Dr. Claire's talk. If you have any questions during the talk, please post them into the chat. Thank you to CodeClimate for sponsoring today's talk, which is all about using feature flags to get fast, actionable feedback about deployed code. But what about feedback before deployment? I've long been a fan of CodeClimate's automated quality checks. They'll alert your team to all kinds of problems in your code before it's deployed. But now CodeClimate's velocity system can identify problems in your process too. It integrates with your existing tools to gather all kinds of data about ongoing work. When it comes to making decisions, intuition isn't enough. You need data. And that's why we're so glad that CodeClimate has sponsored today's talk, which is all about better ways to get data for decisions. At LaunchDarkly, we've identified 4 key pillars of feature management: build, operate, learn, and empower. Feature management is designed to span multiple use cases, all of which are contained in these 4 pillars. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the build pillar, which is about separating deploy from release, targeted rollouts, canary launches, that kind of thing. Last week, we looked at the operate pillar, talking about using flags in long-term operational roles, kill switches, circuit breakers, and dynamic reconfiguration of services. Today, we'll focus on the learn pillar, which is about gathering data to make your releases more successful. Dr. Claire Knight will tell us how GitHub uses feature management to learn how well code changes perform before they're rolled out to users, or to all users. Many teams use agile methodologies to deliver at a rapid pace, but agility is not just about shipping faster, it's also about getting feedback so that you can tell if you're shipping the right thing. You want to move faster, but that can just make things worse if you're headed in the wrong direction. Maybe a new feature isn't one that users want. Maybe they want it, but it has usability problems. Or maybe they love it as it is, and they use it lots, and then your infrastructure buckles because the back-end code needs optimization. You want to find these problems before you release to everyone. You can use feature flags to achieve both faster shipping and clearer navigation. You can learn the important problems before they become showstoppers. Learn covers feature flag use cases that enable teams to continually learn from their software and users. In Learn, developers, DevOps engineers, product managers, and others use feature flags to conduct beta tests more seamlessly and gain feedback from real users earlier in the development process. To run multivariate experiments on any new changes, whether they're front-end features, new algorithms, or even large infrastructure changes. And to set baseline metrics to compare the performance of one feature variant to another, while also measuring the impact of certain features on system performance. That's the theory. But how do big engineering organizations practice it? So today we have Dr. Claire Knight joining us from the UK. So if you have any trouble with my accent, I'm afraid it won't get much better from here. She's a senior engineering manager at GitHub, and she's here to explain how they use feature flag techniques, such as testing in production, or as they call it, staff shipping, and traffic replication, to get early insight into how well new code performs. Her presentation is 20 minutes long, followed by a live Q&A session. Feel free to post your questions in the chat while she's talking. We'll address as many as we can. Take it away, Dr. Knight.
Hey folks, I'm coming to you today from the UK to talk to you about shipping and learning fast via feature flags. We already know that feature flags are a really great way for selectively targeting users. It's a well-established pattern. LaunchDarkly are a way to do that if you don't have other ways. They have some great documents on their website. I want to talk to you today about some of the things we do at GitHub, which is beyond the kind of delivering to production and then releasing to your users. I want to talk to you about how you can collaborate with colleagues, develop in production, and learn from real-world usage too. These are all things that can potentially accelerate the speed with which you can put something into production in a safe way without needing to rely on kill switches. I'm going to talk a little bit about two ways you can do that through this talk. Give you a little bit of background to set the scene for those of you that are not super familiar with feature flags. I will set that in the scene of how we do things at GitHub with kind of what I would call usual feature flag usage, and then talk in more detail about these other things. It may sound counterintuitive, but really it's not, I promise. So, who am I? I'm Claire Knight. I'm based in the UK and I work for GitHub. I'm an engineer turned engineering manager. I have spent many years coding things, front end, back end, mobile apps, all sorts of things. So I've got quite a lot of experience of things like feature flags and conditional paths in code beyond the if statement. I know that's a conditional thing in code. In-app purchases are a form of feature flag. It's just somebody's paid for something and another user hasn't, for example. When I joined GitHub, I joined as an engineer, so I've worked in the code base. I've experienced feature flags from an engineering perspective. I've definitely experienced them at scale. GitHub certainly has a lot of scale. I'm most experienced with our API, because that's the engineering team that I was on around from an engineering perspective. Since I've become an engineering manager, I've learned a lot of the breadth that we have around feature flags, and the various impacts that has at scale. Feature flags are fantastic for rolling out things, but you have to also be careful. If you leave them in the code too long, you then have a page load doubling and tripling over a period of time because it's got to check so many feature flags for things, especially in a case where they're all enabled. It would be, useful to clean those up. Those are the sorts of considerations that I now think about and led me to some of the things I wanted to talk to you in this talk. So I wanted to do a quick overview of feature flags and how we've used them in GitHub for those of you that might not be aware or not particularly up to speed with feature flags in general. The first of these is the kind of release later. Got the very popular ship it squirrel there. But if something goes into production and you're working with continuous deployment as we do at GitHub, you may not always want it to be available to everybody at the point that code is merged and released. One of the things that I'm sure you're all aware of is the large initiatives we tend to ship at our conferences at GitHub. For all of those, we have a bunch of features made available and developed on over the months prior to that, and we will often want to staff ship those, which means that we as employees of GitHub get to test these things out, trial them, deal with some rough edges. We are very much eat your own dog food at GitHub, and also running user experiments on ourselves. We're not necessarily the most typical users, so I'll come on to that in user experiments in a moment, but what this feature flag functionality allows us to do is to get things ready, and then as the keynotes are happening, as the announcements are being made, we can then turn these on for all customers or beta customers, whatever we've set up. So, this is something that if you're not using them right now would be, a really useful way for you to adapt your service-based software to take use of these things. The second one is user experiments. So I've already said that we will staff ship things a lot at GitHub. User experiments are taking that a step further. It's finding use cases and users for things that we may not do so much internally. There's, for example, things around the open source community. We have relationships with maintainers, and we will often talk to them and run some experiments with them about their use cases, which are very different to us running GitHub on GitHub. We also like to use that to get feedback from larger groups of customers, for example, and to scale it. So this brings me on to the last one, which is the scaling of sort of alpha and beta testing. We've got a very well-known case of that, which started late 2018 and then kind of rolled out over the rest of 2019, and that's GitHub Actions. We had a first version, we put that out there, we had a lot of hype, a lot of excitement, a lot of very early users up until we hit our limits, and we learned so much from them, so much so that we reworked so much stuff to make the Actions versions 2 so much stronger and deliver more for our customers. We couldn't have done that without feature flags. And we also learned about operating feature flags at scale in terms of scaling that up to the many thousands that ultimately were able to access this code. So I mean, it depends where you are on your journey, what the type of software you have is, but there are some really great, starting points, well trodden paths with feature flag usage. And just a shout out to the folks organising this LaunchDarkly, they've got some great documentation on their website about this as well, if you need to go read up. However, what if you could? That magic thing. What if you want to be sure of a release before it's released? And I don't mean necessarily by staff shipping. You might want a slice to see how things happen for a certain vertical of your users. You might care about how some infrastructure responds. Things like those. You may have operational concerns that you need to kind of work out the rough edges of. I know we have feature flags as a concept of a kill switch. So you can release something and then just yank it and remove its impact straight away. But that's very rough. It can disengage users if it takes away something they've started to rely on, for example. So, how can we make safer releases without needing to rely on those things? Let me talk to you about that. So I want to talk about kind of two swathes of things you could do here. And I'm going to talk about some examples, but of course I am going to have to keep some specifics hidden, as I'm sure you understand here. I want to talk about these two separate things, and then I am going to, I'm afraid, give you some caveats, but I think they probably apply to most feature flags. But I don't just want you to get so excited you run off and do some great stuff and then forget about the kind of impact beyond that. The first thing I want to talk about is what I'm calling a super minimal ship. It's kind of a techie term for which I apologise, but when we say we ship something, it means we've taken a piece of functionality, we've developed the code around it, and we have put that out there. When I say put that out there, I mean it's released into the production code or production sites. I don't necessarily mean that all your users have access to that. That's kind of where you're using feature flags for wider rollout. So I want to cover why this has been really useful. And I think as we adapt to the current world environment where there's a lot more remote working, it may be beneficial to some of you to think about how to do this. GitHub is and has been a remote company for a long while, almost since its inception, I believe. So one of the things that super minimal ships let you do is to collaborate within teams and across teams, across time zone boundaries, in a way that is very low impact on those that are not exposed to this stuff, but really accelerates what those that are exposed to it and working with it can deliver for you. So if you have a feature, you may have 1, 2, 3, 4 engineers working on that for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks. Everybody's development cycle is different. What I would advocate, and what we have done to good effect, is to have the first PR of any feature be setting up the feature flag and then some kind of skeleton. Often that's going to be a URL for something that's running on the web. It might not be, but just, a new page, a new piece of functionality in a page we might put behind a separate URL until we kind of tidy that up, for example. You'll need to use a little bit of judgment. Your engineers will probably have some views on that, and it's going to be very specific to you, but that's the kind of principle. Once that has shipped, you've basically unblocked then all of the folks that need to work on that, whatever time zone they're in, to be able to contribute locally and in production, which is kind of the key point here. And there is relative safety. I say relative because anything running on your production system is never 100% safe. You can have power outages at data centers, and it doesn't matter how awesome your code is, that can cause issues for you. So let's stick with relatively safely. When we say locally in production, it means obviously you have your local development environments, but there's going to be the need to make some changes around this feature that you then need to share with your colleagues. And you also may want to see how that looks with real data. I think and this is my next bullet point, that, people will come like, well, use feature branches. You can all share the feature branches. Okay, it's not going to be in production, you won't get the real data, but you've got staging and all of these things. And that's a very fair point. It depends, again, like everything in software, on how you're set up, the speed you're moving, how many engineers you've got, how your development cycles work. But GitHub is very, very fast-paced development. We have hundreds of engineers contributing to our main code base all of the time. We do continuous deployment, which can mean hundreds of deploys every week. So for us, long-lived feature branches, or even quite honestly short-lived branches, can get problematic. And if you're expecting a team to be working on something for a few weeks, the merge hell that would accompany the end of that would potentially invalidate a lot of the testing that you had then done. So what this allows you to do in these dynamic environments where you're constantly shipping is to keep up with everything that everybody else is making available, and ensure your new feature works very well with that. I think also it's worth shouting out here that by trialing and tweaking things in production, you can account for some of the edge cases. You're never going to cover them all, and as a feature is developed and only a few people have access to it, you're not going to necessarily get the volumes of data, but you are going to learn some of the edge cases, some of this doesn't show unless I've got this piece of data or this thing enabled. And that, with the best will in the world, with all the unit tests and various functional tests and those sorts of things, are things that can accidentally get forgotten when we don't think about those very edge cases. Obviously, this is not a free ride in that sense. Your engineers need to still code defensively. We need to cope with null pointers, empty objects, again, language dependent. You're still going to need the observability that you're already running in production, I hope. You may want to enhance that on the new feature straight away, just so you can see, whoa, this database query on this page is taking a heck of a long time and there's only 6 of us enabled with this. We need to look at that before we take this to production for real. But it really does enable you to see all of these things very early on. And then when you do come to kind of make this available to customers, be that sort of a staff ship within GitHub and then a beta and then making it live, you're going to be able to plan for some of the things you might want to specifically test for, and also things that might appear and you've kind of preempted them. So that is something, and I want to call out here now we're more remote as well, is that what this enables is that you're not stuck on people being synchronous. You can have somebody in the UK do some work and commit it in the morning here, and then their colleague wakes up on the East Coast, and the person in the UK is still online, but there's something there for their colleague to pick up on and run with, and then you can hand off to the West Coast, and you can hand off into Asia. You can go around the globe if it depends how you set up your engineering teams too, but for where they are spread and the spread of expertise, you can make this work without needing a lot of synchronous calls and things like that. Because you're shipping such small things each time, it's very easy for the people picking things up to understand stuff. The next thing I wanted to talk about is planning for migration and scale. The concept of sort of using feature flags to change from one database to another, or some infrastructure change, is also a relatively known pattern. But what I want to cover is, how do you know that switching to that new thing is even likely to work when you have a lot of unknowns, or there's some new piece of hardware or some new way of doing something within a database that you're trying out? Absolutely, you will have done some small experiments. You may have done load testing, chaos testing. What I think feature flags can give you here is, like with the code changes, a means of exploring that scaling. So, will scaling work as expected? Sadly, it's often not linear. There are things that are hidden. You hit sort of bottlenecks in external technologies that you didn't realize were there until it's too late. This is not going to be foolproof, of course, but it hopefully will work towards giving you more confidence in the things that you're doing, and rule in or out technical spikes relatively early on, perhaps. So you can then focus all of your effort on things that will give you the payoff that you're after. So one of the things that we have used at GitHub is to do some additional database writes. Now, obviously, you need to make care there that you're not going to be doubling the response time to the user, and there are technical ways of achieving that, but we have definitely used this where we've written extra things into a database to see what the impact of a change would be, so then we can compare old and new. And this is pre the feature shipping. We're not making that assumption that this is going to work and we just need to double the database or some such. In doing this, we can then perform analysis on those writes. We can look at the observability that we'll have set up into that second place, and actually determine that, yes, actually what we have is going to be okay, or maybe not. We better pull in some extra resource there. That one has been really useful to us on a number of things, and I'd really recommend you look into that if that's a pain point that you think you have or are likely to have. Another thing that you can do, again, you can do this as you want to load balance. That's kind of the point of load balancing. But feature flags allow you to route a certain percentage of traffic to two places, depending on what level your feature flags are and where your routing is, obviously. But that's a way of taking a request and fulfilling it to the user as normal, as they would see it, but also sending it to somewhere else so that we can do some different processing on it, some potentially return something in a different way, run it through some different hardware to see the impact of that. So you're kind of duplicating the request you get in. At that point, you're then sending one off into the ether, as far as the users are concerned. They're not aware of this and this goes away. But then the other one, does the normal thing and goes back to them, and they're unaware, but you're collecting important data around the scaling side of things here. Another one is to add additional observability, to write out more alerts, to graph some extra things, and then make a decision. So we turn this flag on for certain users or certain accounts, and that will allow us to capture extra data. And combined with flag control audits, you can then do some data analysis that will let you decide if the scaling is going to behave as you expect, at least up until a certain point. They're two kind of related but separate things. One is very much at a code level and one is more at an infrastructure level, but I think they'll both allow you to think about and reason about things in different ways than you might have thought about. I want to just quickly cover some caveats though. Remember that flags add complexity, any flag, be that for the things I've talked about or for the more well-known reasons for using them. The more code paths there are to reason about during development and have test coverage of, the harder it gets for engineers to do things, the harder it is to test things. Just be mindful of that. They are really useful, but don't overuse them. Relatedly, long-lived flags become technical debt. If something is completely rolled out or completely turned off, tidy them up after a period of time. Don't cause headaches for yourself is what I'll be saying. And then the final one, which I just think it's worth saying, though I hope you're all aware of this, is that you really need to move with care. Anything you do in production is a risk to reliability in your customers. With the best will in the world, nobody was going to have 100% uptime. But if you can take steps to safeguard that with the techniques that I've talked about here, plus everything else, I think your customers are going to be happier about that. those were the kind of important caveats, and I think they apply to all feature flags. And yeah, that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent talk, Claire. Thank you so much for sharing that. So now it's time for our live Q&A session. We have Claire with us for the next 20 minutes or so. Please post your questions in the chat and we will try to answer them as many as we can. So we've already got a few questions, I think. The first one is from Madan Kumar Jayaraman. If I've got that, please tell me if I've got that wrong. Who asks, does GitHub use LaunchDarkly?
No. I'm sorry, folks.
That's
sorry,
fine.
We don't actually use it. We have been using the same system for 8 years now, possibly getting on 9, depending on. I've lost track of time at the moment, given this year. There's a lot of effort, engineering effort, experience, and all sorts of things gone into it.
Right.
You might want to seriously consider other options than build your own if that's not your core thing.
Right. There's actually something I wrote an article about a little while ago that I think if Jess can post the link in the chat. But yeah, if you're tempted to write your own, there's a bunch of very decent open source options out there. And I think GitHub started with an open source product, didn't it?
Yeah, the person that created the Flipper Gen, which is the one we use, was at GitHub at the time. He used his experience from prior jobs plus his need at GitHub at the time, and then we have over the years tried to open source various component things that we've done, and that was one of them. So I think it was pretty much open source from the outset.
That's great. GitHub's been a really good citizen in that way, in terms of there's so many open source projects that GitHub has put out there as part that it's built as part of just doing its thing. Yeah,
and we don't want to. If we can help and give back, then why not? I mean, obviously, there may be certain things we may have a fork that we keep for certain things that we've put out there. But yeah, I mean, and I'm not suggesting that's the right solution for you. It may be better for you to just pay somebody to handle this for you for the most part, apart from the actual turning on and off of things.
Right. Yeah, and this is what we see as well, is that usually the really big companies, the GitHubs and Googles and Facebooks, have been doing this for so long. I mean, often since before LaunchDarkly even started, that they built their own in-house system. It's become totally woven into all their operations. They're totally used to it. But with people starting with feature management now, it's far better to ride on the maturity of an existing product and existing experience there than to try and build it yourself, is what we've found.
Yeah, I would second that. There's so many edge cases and things that we even occasionally are close to missing, and we have that experience. So for anybody that doesn't, and the simple things like if a request is coming in, you can't, and the web browser then refreshes, or there's an AJAX request in the background, you have to make sure that consistency of flag is applied through the duration of all of that.
Yeah.
It sounds like logical from a user point of view, but there's a technical challenge to that. So
yeah, it's really easy to miss. And this is the kind of thing that we actually I've been writing a guide that hopefully will go live soon about that and you can avoid some of these problems with LaunchDarkly, but certainly not all of them. You've got to be pretty thoughtful when you're juggling stuff on both the front and back end to make sure state is consistent.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very easy to miss. So we've got another question from Clark Cates George. Can you share some of the differences between developing with flags versus developing with feature branches, or combination of the two, and how they play together?
Yeah, I mean, there is absolutely nothing wrong with feature branches. I want to put that out there straight away. It's a core part of most development. I won't say all. Yeah, I may have pushed a master the other day, but not .com. I hasten to add, not our main product. It was just a documentation thing into a small team repo. But yeah, even then I try not to. The biggest problem we have with a feature that's going to take more than a few days to develop, which for many features is going to be true, is that because we are constantly shipping our product with NCI and it goes, we deploy hundreds of times a day. It's the getting out of date that causes us a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the merge conflicts that then causes when you've got a large code base with hundreds of engineers working on it. If you are a handful of folks, then maybe using feature flags is going to be overkill for you, and a feature branch is totally the right move. It's like anything in software engineering. It depends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's even, I mean, having my previous job was a very small one, literally the engineering team was only a handful of people, but even then, we got ourselves into trouble with feature branches just going on for a couple of weeks, maybe a month, and then that merge is just really difficult.
Yeah, it is. And obviously again, it's a bit like the conversation about we've got long ingrained Flipper
Mm-hmm.
feature management. We've got, a massive suite now of tests that run in CI and things all of the time. But even they can't save you sometimes if you've got so much, diversion from the main branch, because then the tests break and then people will make mistakes in resolving them. With the best will in the world, we're all human. So this allows us to, it's a cool thing. It allows the engineering team working on it to testing it as they go.
Right.
And also avoids this pain. So it's kind of a double win rather than one negative,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think this is a point you made really well during the talk, which is that in theory, systems like Git, code review, and automated tests will catch a lot of problems. But as scale increases, you get more and more edge cases. You get, you start to really push the boundaries. And I think those of us who with experience with merge problems know that you can't trust Git to get it right every time.
You absolutely can't know. And it's a fantastic tool, and obviously it's a core part of GitHub, obviously.
Right.
But yeah, you still need engineer intuition and ability and things, and long-lived feature branches in fast-paced companies and large companies where you're all working on the same thing are problematic even without feature flags.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, so it's great to be able to mix the two in that way. So actually, the follow-up question from that, which is, why not just leave everything behind flags forever for flexibility?
Well, this is kind of close to my heart because I care about resiliency, so therefore I want flags, but I also care about tech debt.
Right.
And if you don't clean up your flags, you end up with the obvious tech debt in the code, but you also end up with a performance debt.
Right.
If we had not cleaned up the flags that we have live, we would have probably have tens of thousands of them now in the lifetime of GitHub. Can you imagine waiting for tens of thousands of checks on flags to load if you just want to
Right.
view your profile page?
Right.
That's going to
Exactly.
be painful.
Well, it depends. Although, sorry, this is where I feel required to put in a bit of promo for LaunchDarkly here in the way that.
Oh, of course, go ahead.
Thank you so much. The way that LaunchDarkly SDKs evaluate flags is that they do it entirely in memory in process. They maintain a connection to the flag server, and changes are sent down asynchronously so that when it's time to evaluate a flag, can do it instantly. But it's not free. It's much cheaper, but it's not free. And certainly the complexity cost is absolutely there.
Yeah. I mean, we obviously have some kind of caching. We're not literally querying the
Right.
database for every flag every time for everything. That would just, well, it would have caused our data center to explode by now. Let's be honest.
Right.
But yeah, the other, I think, thing that's probably worth mentioning, given we're talking about using flags for resiliency and learning as well, is that by having all of the flags enabled, you're putting a massive burden on your engineers and your on-call folk if something's gone wrong, is to determine what path something has hit, because
Right.
each feature flag is a potential alternative path through the code.
Mm-hmm.
And that cognitive burden in a handful of cases is fine. Even hundreds of cases potentially in a large system is fine. But if you start getting thousands and tens of thousands, then
Oh yeah.
yeah.
No, it's a nightmare. And then suddenly, the vast majority of your code is just, you know, feature flag alternatives that never get hit.
Yeah,
Much
definitely.
harder to read. So this leads into a great question from my colleague Dawn Parzic, who I previously mentioned. Any suggestions or strategies to manage that tech debt when it comes to flag?
It's gonna. I hate necessarily using the word culture here because that can be misrepresented.
Right.
It does depend on your organization setup, shall we say, and how you operate things.
Mm-hmm.
At GitHub, we again, it's pretty well publicized. We use like a lot of chat ops, and we have the Hubot bot, and we automate things.
Right.
So one of the things that we're actually currently exploring is having Hubot remind folks and say this flag is in production but not enabled, or this flag is in production and completely rolled out, which are the two sort of clean cases. You've never turned this on, or it's rolled out for everybody. Why is it still a flag type of there are gray areas in between. And to have automation remind folks and to ping teams that they need to tidy up things. One of the reasons we wanted to look at the automation side of it is not only to save somebody a job of doing something that we can automate, but it's also that folks don't get as angry when Hubot tells them to do something versus
that's a really good point.
What's that doing there? Remove that thing. That's definitely one way that you could think about it, for sure.
That's great. It's that's a really good point about the value of that bots don't mind people being rude at them.
Yeah.
And that reminds me, we or giving them a snack. I love the bots. I don't know if you have the bot snack command, but it's one of my favorites to just do bot snack, and then Hubot goes yum yum yum.
We don't have bot snack, but we do. We can trigger certain kind of meme responses, and if you happen to say thank you, Hubot, possibly sarcastically, he responds with something.
Fabulous. So, but that idea of automatically notifying about, that's great, and it's something that we have some LaunchDarkly in our tooling. We have some facilities for that. I mean, and that we make available to all customers as well, such as we have a system called code references, which you can add to your CI process, which identifies all the areas, all the lines of code that you have that are tied to a particular flag. But yeah, having some automated reminders for cleanup is a great idea. That's and so has it been particularly helpful for this?
We're just literally exploring this at the moment, but we envisage, because it fits in with our other workflow, that it could be beneficial. So we've been doing a bit of an audit of things and trying to, is this following on from your pillar last week, is this a circuit breaker or is this actually a feature flag? And so we've been kind of digging into that just to housekeep ourselves.
That's great. That's great. And that's also a really good point, is that some flags you do want to keep around. They're useful operational flags.
Yeah.
So, question from Tyler Knight. Can you comment on the pros and cons of using feature flags to personalize or customize the product for groups of users?
At first glance on that question, or first thought, I suppose I should say, if you want that customization to be long-lived, then I'm not convinced that a flag is the right place, because as we've said, we can't keep flags around for the longer term. So that's definitely a disadvantage. It would slow down things.
Right.
Eventually, another disadvantage. We definitely do use that when we're doing rollouts around, say, a bug fix, where we have a specific user or organization or type of user,
right,
that we can identify in our system that is known to say have a problem, and we want to do a very limited rollout to say, okay, we acknowledge this problem, or have acknowledged this problem, we think this fixes it, we've tested it, but you have a real world scenario that was clearly failing. Can you now see if this fixes it?
Right.
And most of our customers are pretty on board with that, actually, because we're helping them by fixing it, so they're willing to help us get the right fix for them, not just a fix. So I think personalizing it that way to get a bug fix, but then again, we would roll that out afterwards. We would say, right, we will enable this for everybody and tidy things up. I think for general, just like user customization, I'm not convinced it's the right technology.
It's one my position on that has slightly changed since joining LaunchDarkly last year. It was a very odd one for me to wrap my head around, because I was thinking, wait, so for things like, differentiating between standard and pro features in an account, for example, my standard,
see that.
right, it it's, normally my inclination is just you just put a field in the user record, right? You put a boolean or something in the user record. But the fact is that database migrations are painful. They can take weeks of preparation if depending on the kind of organization and database setup that you have. Whereas creating a feature flag you can do in a minute or two, and given that that junction has to happen in the code anyway, it just comes down to where is the data stored.
Given you've just said that, you've just triggered actually a memory of my prior dev life.
Really?
Yeah, so in the mobile world,
Hmm.
you may have heard both Google and Apple developers complain about this, but in-app purchases are obviously a big thing.
Yes.
Can also be finicky and
Right.
require tender loving care at times. And
Hmm.
actually, an in-app purchase is kind of like a feature flag, but
Right.
it's a device enablement thing, because it's like, has this person subscribed or not subscribed, or have they paid to unlock? I'm not talking about where you just buy a bunch of gems to unlock the next level
Yeah.
of the game. I'm talking about actual
A differentiation between.
pro or not pro.
Right.
That stuff we actually need to query. There are ways of doing server webhooks as well now, but they didn't
Hmm.
used to be. You have to query on the mobile device. So
Right.
that kind of lives in that code. And so in that situation, I can definitely see it. I guess what I would say is, for all the use cases I can think of around GitHub, I don't think it would work very well.
Yeah.
But yeah,
And it's for all of these, there's loads of potential places, loads of different ways to engineer something,
yeah,
and
of
it
course.
comes down to a whole load of factors, especially those that are particular to your instance,
Yeah,
to your situation.
yeah, for sure.
So, how are we doing for time? We're coming up towards the end. We have actually one. I think we have time for one more question here. Another one from Madan Kumar Jayaraman. Which is directed at me. Yoz, are you saying with LaunchDarkly we can have thousands of flags without any performance issues? Well,
On the
it,
spot now.
yes, exactly. Actually, there are some potential performance issues I should warn about. Mostly you can be fine. However, the fact is that it's all data, and the more complex a flag is, especially if there's thousands. We've seen some flags that have thousands of rules in them, or specifiers for individual user IDs that mean that individual flags can be megabytes big. And when that happens, then yes, you will see performance issues, not in evaluation so much, but in startup time when it comes to downloading all those flags and updating all of those flags. Then you will see performance issues. The rest of the time, no. I mean, if your flags are pretty simple, then you can literally have thousands of them, and they should be fine. And mind you, I mean, the thing is, if you have thousands of flags, you've got other problems to deal with, really, when it comes to technical debt and things like that. And so we have, to wrap up the session, one more question for Claire. Is there any advice or things you'd like to leave with the group before we end?
I think it's come up in several answers, and just what you're talking about there, I think, is feature. Everything depends. So it depends is, I guess, my advice. But feature flags are one tool to
Yes.
achieve a bunch of things. They are incredibly powerful because they can do multiple things, and they can do multiple things well. But it's, hammers and screwdrivers have certain purposes. This might be a
Absolutely.
multi-tool, but you still wouldn't try and change a tire on a car with a multi-tool. There are still
Right.
certain things they're not suited for. So I just explore these ideas, see how they might work in your situation with your software and your organization, but don't necessarily expect to pull a solution from some other company and expect it to magically work, other than like employing something like LaunchDarkly. The actual
Mm-hmm.
hosted solution will work great for you, but actually how those flags are defined is going to be very dependent on.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And this has been actually our position at LaunchDarkly as well. We want sure, we would love our customers' money, but really we would rather they do the right thing than necessarily the right thing for them, rather than necessarily using our thing. So we want people to have a positive experience with our product, and that includes not using it for things that it's not meant to be used for. I'm actually thinking that it'd be good to write some posts about there's certain things that flags aren't great for, like dependency changes. Major dependency changes you can't really manage with flags, or it's very difficult to manage with flags anyway. And there's a bunch of other things, but yeah, absolutely right. It's the best. You've got to find the right tool for the job in all situations. So
Look forward to reading the posts.
yes, I hope to do it, and amongst all the other things I've got to do. But yes, so thank you. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. But thank you for joining us today, Claire. It's been great. And I'd also like to thank our audience for attending today's Nano Series talk. And thank you again to CodeClimate for sponsoring today's talk. As I said, you want insight and to learn all kinds of things from your product and from what your developers are doing. And CodeClimate is a great tool for doing that. So remember that you can see previous talks in this series on the Trajectory Conference website. That's trajectoryconf.com. The recording for this talk will be there in a couple of days. Join us this time next week to explore the final the final of the Nano series before Trajectory itself. It will be the Empower pillar with my colleague Heidi Waterhouse and our featured guest Sherry Lim. Until then, have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.